Hi, I'm Peter James, author of the Roy Grace series, of which there are currently 17 books in print. The first titles are Dead Simple, Looking Good Dead, Not Dead Enough, Dead Man's Footsteps. You may be able to spot a theme with the titles there. I'm so excited that Roy Grace has finally come to the screen and is a major television series for ITV. And excites me most of all are the two prime cast members, Simm, who plays my title character Roy Grace, exactly how I always imagined him. He even looks like Roy. And Richie, Campbell, who plays Roy's best friend and sidekick, Glenn Branson, who again is really a doppelganger for the original Glenn Branson I had in my head when I first created these books. How did the idea for the series first come about? The idea very simply came as a result of my being burgled many years ago. And it's before I'd started writing crime novels. I was writing not very good spy thrillers. And a young detective came to the house to take fingerprints. And as a result of that, I became friends with quite a wide number of police officers over the next 15 years in Sussex, regularly being invited out on shifts, response shifts, traffic shifts, and even getting phone calls to say, we're doing a raid tomorrow, do you want to come with us? And I started putting police characters more and more into the psychological thrillers I was then writing. And in 2002, my publishers, Macmillan, asked if I'd ever thought of creating a detective as a central character. And during the previous 5 or so years, I'd become extremely good friends with a young detective inspector called Dave Gaylor. He was with Sussex CID and was a homicide detective. Very bright guy, and I realized this guy had a really creative side, which is something I've subsequently learned, that part of the makeup of a good homicide detective is somebody who has almost a split personality. One half completely anal, very methodical, the other half a real blue sky thinker. And Dave had both those qualities. And by 2002, he'd risen to become Detective Chief Superintendent, essentially head of Major Crime Review for Sussex Police. And I went to him and I said, how would you like to be a fictional cop? And he loved the idea, and I guess, as they say, the rest is history. The Roy Grace novels are primarily set in and around the city of Brighton and Hove in Sussex. And Brighton, luckily for me, has never been that much written about. It's actually a beautiful seaside city, but with a long, long pedigree of violence and crime activity. In 1932, Brighton was called the crime capital of the UK and the murder capital of Europe. And it's a sobriquet that's never gone away. And I've actually had 3 previous chief constables tell me Brighton is a favoured place to live in the UK for first division criminals. So it's a perfect setting for a crime writer. And I was lucky enough to be born and bred and spent all my kind of formative years in Brighton and Hove. So I know every street, every alley, and quite a lot of the villains too. The central characters in Roy Grace is firstly Detective Superintendent Roy Grace himself, who is a homicide detective, son of a police officer. And when we first meet him in Dead Simple, he's just coming up to his 39th birthday, and we discover that 9 years earlier, his wife Sandy, who he loved and adored, had just vanished off the face of the earth. He came home ready to take her out to dinner and she was gone. And for 9 years he's been looking for her, doesn't know whether she ran off with a lover, whether she got murdered, had an accident, kidnapped, what happened to her. And so he continues to function effectively as a homicide detective, but for all those 9 years, in all his spare time, he's been looking for, trying everything, even going to mediums and clairvoyance. And throughout the series, he now starts to move on, he falls in love, remarries, and we start to learn a little bit more and more and more about that mysterious backstory. The second principal character is Glenn Branson, Roy Grace's best mate, confidant, and protege too. And Glenn is based on a real life police officer I went out with on patrol back in about 1995. Big, tall, black guy, shaven head, lovely energy. And he told me he was 32 years old and he was still a police constable. And I said, are you planning to go for a promotion anytime soon? He said, well, no, I've only just joined the police. This is my first week out of probation. He said, I was a nightclub bouncer. And then my kid was born. And I looked down at my kid and I thought, soon you're going to go to school and somebody's going to ask you what your dad does for a living. And I want you to be able to say something you're proud of. And that's when I joined the police. And Roy sees those lovely qualities in Glenn and they've become thick as thieves. And then we have Norman Potting, who is what they call in the police an old sweat. He's like in his mid-50s, he's politically incorrect. He's in many ways a complete dinosaur. But Roy refuses to let him go because he knows this guy is still one of the best detectives he's ever met in his life. And then there's a cast of other characters sort of all around them, but I guess they are, if you like, the principal three. The major themes of the Roy Grace novels are something that my publishers like to call the everyday sinister. Almost no good deed goes unpunished in a way. I am always fascinated by the misfortune that happens to somebody through no fault of their own. Dead Simple, the first book in the series. Michael Harrison, he's really happy, couldn't be happier, he's getting married to the woman of his dreams in a few days' time. But he's always been a bad lad, playing terrible pranks on his mates. And for his stag party, they decide to pay him back. And they've planned it already. They've dug a grave in remote woodlands. They've taken him out in a van, they get him completely smashed, drive him out to the woodlands, put him in a coffin, lower him in the grave with a walkie-talkie and a bottle of whiskey, and they're going to come back in 2 hours' time and dig him up. They cover the grave up, drive off, and they hit a cement truck head on, and they're all killed. And there's just one person who actually knows where Michael Harrison is, and he's got a very good reason to keep quiet. In Looking Good Dead, the second in the series, my character, Tom Bryce, a decent, hard-working guy, is travelling home from London by train, and there's one of those usual idiots talking to him loudly on his phone on the next door seat. Yeah, I'm on the train. And as the guy gets off at a station before Brighton, Tom notices that a memory stick has fallen out of his pocket. He raps on the window, but the guy doesn't hear him. So he does the decent thing. He goes home, sticks it in his computer to see if he can find an address. And he gets driven to a snuff movie. And from that point onwards, his life and his family's life, his wife and his children are all in mortal peril. And in Dead Man's Footsteps, fourth in the series, I used 9/11 because I'd always wanted to write about it in the aftermath. And I have a Brighton businessman who's in terrible financial trouble. And his last chance saloon, there's a friend who works on the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And Ronnie flies to New York to see if he can get a loan from him to pay off his debts. But he arrives late that morning of 9/11 to see the South Tower coming down. And being a chancer, Ronnie thinks to himself, everyone will think I'm in there. So he phones his wife in England and says, play the grieving widow, collect the life insurance, meet me in Australia in a year's time. And the story goes on from there. I have a very close working relationship with Sussex Police, and quite a number of my books have come about because they've asked if I would consider writing something that could highlight a major issue. And my Roy Grace novel, Dead Tomorrow, which came out back in about, I can't remember the exact date, but that is about the incredibly dark world of organ trafficking. And it revolves around a mother who has a teenage daughter. They live in Brighton, and her daughter's going to die if she doesn't get a liver transplant. And the sad truth is that 3 people die every day in England waiting for an organ transplant. And the mother decides to, in desperation, go on the internet. And she finds a German woman there who tells her she can get an organ from a child who's been killed in a car accident. It cost her £300,000. So she begs, borrows, and actually steals the money for the transplant. And the day the transplant's due to take place, she gets a visit from Roy Grace, who tells her, you're expecting to have liver that's going to come from a little girl who's been killed in a traffic accident. That little girl actually is still alive, and she's going to be killed for your daughter this afternoon. And that's the kind of dilemma of that story. And then, but in 2017, the Sussex police asked if I would consider writing about the huge scam of internet dating fraud. People in Sussex alone have been scammed out of over £5 million during the past 3 years. And it led me into a fascinating journey of writing about the dark side of internet dating. What I've most enjoyed writing about the Roy Grace series is that I love learning things. And I have always loved the research. I've loved in particular really getting to know and understand what it means to be a police officer. You know, I think we tend to see there's very much a wall in a way between the police and the rest of the world. I've even heard officers say us and civilians. But what we civilians don't see is that police officers are actually ordinary people. The head of the Met some years ago once said, you know, we are ordinary people doing extraordinary things. When everyone else is running away from danger, we and the other emergency services are the ones running towards it. And people forget that police officers see the most dreadful things. They might have to attend a dreadful fatal car accident, or a couple whose lives have been ruined because they've been conned out of their life savings, or two small children who've been gassed to death by their mother, which actually happened in Sussex, trying to frame her husband who she was divorcing. And then they go home to their own kids, bath them, put them to bed, read them stories, and with no preparation for that whatsoever. And I think we forget about that, and I find that fascinating. And I find also fascinating how a homicide detective like Roy Grace, and I've been so fortunate having the real life model of Dave Gaylor to base Roy on, to see how he copes with the horrific murders he has to attend. And it's not just solving of the crime, it's the way it always becomes personal to a good homicide detective. You know, he will bond with the victim's family. And you'll so often read of a police detective who's not solved a murder, is retired, and still doggedly stays on that right up to his dying day. They can't let go, and I love that about them.